Code black. Confirm my identity. Alicia Brooks whispered into the phone just as the first impact rattled her front door, the sound echoing through the small one-story house like a storm arriving too early in the morning, red and blue lights washing over the pale siding, cutting through the thin curtains and stretching across the hardwood floor in long, trembling lines as if the walls themselves were unsure what was about to unfold. Outside engines idled in a low mechanical hum, dozens of them. Heavy, patient, organized, the kind of presence that didn't come by mistake. And yet inside, Alicia stood still in the center of her living room, barefoot on cool wood, her breathing slow, measured, her eyes steady in a way that didn't match the chaos pressing in from every direction. She wore a simple gray sweatshirt and loose cotton pants, the uniform of someone who had just come off a long shift caring for others, someone who fixed broken things quietly and went home without asking to be seen. The faint scent of antiseptic still clung to her sleeves, a reminder of the hospital corridors she had walked just hours before, where fluorescent lights buzzed softly and people spoke in hushed urgency. A world away from the sharp floodlights now cutting across her windows. Outside, boots moved in coordinated patterns, radios crackled with clipped instructions, and a voice, firm and practiced, called out her name like it already carried judgment. Alicia Brooks, as if saying it loud. Enough would make it smaller, easier to control, but inside, her name remained her own, untouched. She lowered the phone slightly, listening, not to the noise outside but to something deeper, something steady beneath the surface, the kind of calm that doesn't come from ignorance, but from knowing exactly what's at stake. The door trembled again, not breaking, just reminding her that time was narrowing, that decisions had already been made without her. Assumptions built on sight, on silence, on the quiet way she lived her life in a neighborhood where people nodded politely but never really asked questions, because a woman like her wasn't supposed to hold anything worth asking about, wasn't supposed to be anything more than what they saw. And yet, as the lights outside intensified and shadows stretched longer across her walls, Alicia didn't move toward the door, didn't rush, didn't panic. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, as if aligning herself with something unseen but unshakable, the phone still warm in her hand, the call already placed, the words already spoken, somewhere far beyond the reach of flashing lights and raised voices. The message had landed, and now, all that remained was the waiting, the quiet, deliberate waiting that settled over the room like a held breath, as the world outside prepared to force its way in, unaware that everything they believed about this moment was already beginning to shift. The sound of the second impact did not come immediately, and that pause, that strange hesitation between intention and action, gave the morning an unnatural stillness that did not belong to the flashing lights or the line of vehicles stretching nearly half a block down the quiet suburban street. Neighbors had begun to gather at a distance, some standing behind drawn curtains, others stepping onto porches in house slippers and robes, drawn by the glow of emergency lights cutting across lawns. Still damp with early dew, Alicia Brooks remained exactly where she was, the phone now lowered to her side, her gaze drifting briefly toward the kitchen where a ceramic mug sat untouched beside the sink, steam long gone, a reminder that her night had ended like any other, clocking out just before sunrise, driving home along familiar roads, stopping at the same intersection where the traffic light always lingered a little too long. None of it had suggested that this moment would follow, that an entire system would arrive at her door, as if her existence alone required explanation. Outside, a voice grew sharper, more insistent, calling her name again, louder this time, layered with authority that expected immediate compliance. But Alicia did not rush. She moved with quiet intention, each step measured as she crossed the small living room, her hand brushing lightly against the back of a worn armchair, the fabric softened by years of use, a place where she often sat at the end of long shifts, letting silence settle around her like a second skin. She paused near the window, not close enough to be seen clearly, but enough to observe the pattern outside, the positioning of vehicles, the posture of officers, the way their attention was fixed forward, unified, certain, as if the outcome had already been written before anyone knocked. Her expression did not change, but something behind her eyes sharpened, not fear, not defiance. Something older, something that understood systems, that recognized patterns in the way power gathered and moved, the way it assumed, the way it rarely questioned itself. She had seen it before, not here, not in this quiet neighborhood with trimmed hedges and identical mailboxes, but in rooms where decisions were made far from public view, where language was precise and consequences were measured in ways most people never noticed, and that memory, that awareness, settled into her posture like a foundation. Outside, a figure stepped forward from the line of officers, taller than the rest, his presence defined not by volume, but by control. Captain Richard Hale scanned the front of the house with a practiced gaze, his jaw set, his stance rigid, every movement suggesting that he believed in the order he represented, that he trusted the process that had brought him here. Even if the details were still unfolding, he lifted a hand slightly, signaling a pause, and for a brief moment, the noise outside softened, radios quieted, footsteps slowed, and in that narrow pocket of stillness, Alicia reached for the door handle, her fingers resting against the cool metal, not turning it yet, just holding it, feeling the weight of the moment, the unseen lines connecting everything that had led here. Her voice did not rise when she finally spoke, but it carried, steady and clear through the thin barrier between inside and out. "I am opening the door," she said, not as a question, not as permission, but as a statement of timing, and as her hand turned the handle slowly, the early morning light poured in, washing over her face, revealing calm where tension was expected, and something else, something the officers outside could not yet name, but would soon be forced to understand. The door opened just enough to break the line between assumption and reality, and in that narrow space Alicia Brooks stood framed by the soft interior light behind her and the harsh white beams outside, her posture straight, her hands visible, her expression calm in a way that did not match the tension pressing toward her from the street. Captain Richard Hale stepped forward with measured precision, his boots stopping exactly at the edge of her walkway, as if he had drawn an invisible boundary that only he was allowed to cross. His eyes moved quickly over her face, her clothing, the interior behind her, cataloging, assessing, searching for something that would confirm what he already believed. But Alicia did not offer him anything to validate that expectation. She simply stood there, steady, grounded, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment long before the engines arrived and the lights began to spin. Hale spoke first, his voice controlled, firm, shaped by years of authority that rarely went challenged. He stated that they had received information that required immediate action, that cooperation would make things easier, that hesitation would only complicate matters. His words carried the weight of procedure, of systems built to move quickly and decisively. But beneath that, there was something else, something unspoken, a certainty that he was standing on the correct side of the situation. Alicia listened without interruption, her gaze never dropping, never hardening, simply present, absorbing every word as if she were measuring not just what was said but how it was said, how the space between the words revealed more than the statements themselves. Behind Hale, officers adjusted their positions slightly, maintaining formation, their attention fixed forward, the subtle shifts of weight, the tightening of grips, the controlled breathing of people prepared for escalation even when none had yet occurred. The neighborhood watched in silence, the kind of silence that carried curiosity, concern, and distance all at once. Alicia finally spoke, her voice even, not raised, not defensive. She asked a simple question: "What exactly do you believe is inside this house that required this response?" And for a fraction of a second, something in Hale's expression paused, not doubt, but recalibration, as if the question had not been part of the expected script. He answered with generalities, references to reports, to potential risks, to the necessity of acting before situations developed further. His language remained careful, but it avoided specifics, and Alicia noticed that the way clarity was replaced with control, the way certainty was asserted without being fully explained. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, as if she had heard enough to understand the shape of the moment. Her hand moved slightly, not toward him, not toward anything threatening, but toward the door frame beside her, grounding herself in the physical reality of the space she occupied. This was her home, a place measured not in square footage but in Quiet routines, in nights returned safely, in mornings that usually began without interruption, and now that space was being redefined by presence, by authority, by assumption, Hale took a small step closer, not crossing the threshold, but narrowing the distance, his tone shifting subtly, firmer now, pressing for compliance, for entry, for resolution. But Alicia did not step back. She did not yield the space behind her. Instead, she met his gaze fully and said, "You are operating on incomplete information." The statement was not emotional, not confrontational. It was precise, delivered with the same calm certainty that had guided her since the first sound at the door. And in that moment, something changed, not outside, not yet, but in the space between them, where control and understanding began to pull in opposite directions. And for the first time since the vehicles arrived, the outcome was no longer as predictable as it had seemed. Captain Richard Hale held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if testing whether stillness could be mistaken for weakness, the early morning air carrying a faint chill that settled between them, thin but noticeable, the kind that made every second feel slightly longer than it should. Behind him, the formation of officers remained intact, but the edges of that formation had begun to loosen in small, almost imperceptible ways, a shift of weight here, a glance exchanged there, subtle. Signs that certainty was no longer absolute. Alicia Brooks did not move from the doorway, the threshold beneath her feet becoming more than just wood and frame. It was a line she understood, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be respected. Her home behind her remained quiet, undisturbed, a contrast to the controlled urgency outside. Hale spoke again, this time with less explanation and more directive, stating that they would proceed if necessary, that delays would not change the outcome, that cooperation was still the best option. His words carried the tone of finality, but Alicia recognized the difference between authority that was absolute and authority that was asserting itself to remain intact. She tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in observation, as if she were studying a pattern unfolding in real time. Her voice, when it came, was softer than his, but it did not carry less weight. "You have already made a decision before arriving," she said, "and now you are trying to fit me into it." The statement hung in the space between them, not loud, not aggressive, but precise enough to land exactly where it needed to. A few feet away, one of the officers adjusted his radio, the static briefly breaking the tension before fading again into silence. The neighborhood remained still, the kind of stillness that listens, that waits, that senses when something is about to turn even if it does not yet know how. Hale's expression tightened. Slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, the kind that comes when control begins to encounter something it cannot immediately categorize. He stepped forward another inch, careful, deliberate, closing distance without crossing into escalation, and asked her directly to step outside fully, to allow them to proceed. His voice measured, but now carrying an undercurrent of insistence that had not been there before. Alicia considered the request, not emotionally, not defensively, but with the same quiet calculation that had guided her since the beginning. She stepped forward just enough to stand fully in the doorway, the morning light now falling evenly across her face, revealing not tension, but clarity. Her hands remained visible, relaxed at her sides, and in that posture there was no fear, no urgency, only control of herself, which in that moment was the only thing that truly mattered. She spoke again, slower this time, each word chosen with care. "I will step outside," she said, "but you will not enter this house. Not yet." The phrasing was deliberate, not a refusal, not a concession, but a boundary defined in time. Hale paused, just long enough for the weight of that condition to register, and for the first time, the rhythm of the scene shifted away from his pace, away from the structure he had brought with him, into something less predictable. Alicia stepped forward onto the porch, the wood creaking softly beneath her feet, the distance between her and the line of officers. Now clear, visible, measurable, and yet the true distance, the one that mattered, remained untouched. As she lifted her eyes once more to meet Hale's, there was something in her gaze that did not belong to the moment alone, something that suggested this was not where her story began, and certainly not where it would end, and somewhere beyond the line of flashing lights, beyond the assumptions that had gathered here. Something unseen was already moving into place. The moment Alicia Brooks stepped fully onto the porch, the balance of the scene shifted in a way that no one announced, but everyone felt. The distance between her and the line of officers now measured in a few quiet feet of wood and concrete. Yet the tension stretched far beyond that, pulling tight across every pair of watching eyes. Captain Richard Hale adjusted his stance, not retreating, not advancing, but anchoring himself in place as if refusing to let the situation move beyond his control. His voice came again, firmer now, shaped by a need to re-establish authority that had begun to thin at the edges. He instructed her to remain where she was, to keep her hands visible, to answer questions clearly and without delay. The words carried a rhythm that had been repeated countless times in situations where compliance was expected, where outcomes followed familiar patterns. But this moment did not settle into that pattern. Alicia stood with her shoulders relaxed, her posture open, her hands resting naturally at her sides, offering no resistance and yet no submission beyond what she had already chosen. Her gaze moved briefly past Hale, not searching for escape, not looking for help, but observing the arrangement of vehicles, the alignment of bodies, the way attention was distributed across the scene. She noticed how some officers watched her directly while others scanned the house behind her, how radios remained quiet now, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet arrived. Hale stepped slightly closer, closing the gap by inches, his presence now more immediate, his tone sharpening as he began to ask direct questions about her identity, her activities, the reason she was present in the home at that hour, each question structured to lead, to narrow, to guide her into a predefined narrative. Alicia listened, not interrupting, not reacting, allowing each word to settle before she responded. When she finally spoke, her voice remained even, unhurried. She answered, simply stating her name, her profession, the time she had returned home. Nothing more, nothing less. She did not elaborate, did not offer unnecessary detail. And that restraint created a space that Hale seemed compelled to fill. His questions came faster now, layered, overlapping slightly, pressing for something that would justify the scale of what had been set in motion. A faint murmur moved through the gathered neighbors, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to register, a collective awareness that something did not align, that the woman standing calmly on her porch did not match the intensity of the response surrounding her. Alicia remained still, grounded, the morning light now fully illuminating her face, revealing a calm that was not fragile but anchored. Hale paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for a crack in her composure, something he could use to reassert certainty. When he spoke again, his voice carried a subtle edge, a question framed less as inquiry and more as challenge, asking why someone like her would be connected to information that triggered such a response. The phrasing hung heavy, not because of volume, but because of implication, and in that moment, the underlying assumption became visible. Alicia met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged, and answered with quiet precision. You came here because of what you were told, not because of what you know. The words landed softly but with weight, creating a pause that extended beyond sound. Even the air seemed to hold still for a breath longer than expected. Hale did not respond immediately, and that hesitation, small as it was, marked the first visible fracture in the certainty he had carried onto the street. Behind him, one officer shifted. Another glanced toward the end of the block, as if sensing something approaching. Though nothing had yet appeared, the engines continued to idle, the lights continued to flash, but beneath that steady surface, something deeper had begun to change, something that no longer moved according to the plan that had brought them there. And Alicia Brooks stood at the center of it, not raising her voice, not stepping back, simply holding her ground as the weight of the moment continued to build around her. The street did not grow louder, it grew quieter, as if every sound had been pulled back just enough to make space for something unseen to arrive. The flashing lights continued their steady rhythm, but even that seemed distant now, like a signal fading behind thick glass. Alicia Brooks stood motionless on the porch, the cool morning air brushing lightly against her skin, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and engine heat. Her breathing remained even, her shoulders relaxed, but her awareness sharpened, extending beyond the line of officers, beyond the gathered neighbors, reaching into that subtle shift she had felt before anyone else acknowledged it. Captain Richard Hale noticed it too, though not in the same way. His eyes flicked briefly toward the far end of the block, then back to Alicia, as if refusing to give that instinct more weight than his authority allowed. He spoke again, but the words lacked the same edge they had carried moments before, asking her to clarify her last statement, to explain what she meant by incomplete information. The question was controlled, but there was a thread of uncertainty woven through it now. Thin but present, Alicia did not answer immediately. She allowed the silence to settle first, the kind of silence that does not demand attention but commands it anyway, the kind that stretches just long enough for people to become aware of their own thoughts, their own assumptions, their own position within the moment. A breeze moved through the street, gentle but deliberate, lifting the edge of a loose paper near the curb and sending it skimming across the pavement before it came to rest against a tire. Small, ordinary details that seemed suddenly amplified in the absence of noise. Alicia finally spoke, her voice steady, almost quiet. "You are here because someone believed something without verifying it," she said. "And now you are acting as if belief is the same as truth." The words did not accuse, did not rise in volume, but they carried a clarity that made them difficult to ignore. Hale's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance to a narrative that did not align with the one he had been given. Behind him, one of the officers shifted his stance again, this time more noticeably, his attention drawn not to Alicia, but further down the street, where something had begun to change. It was subtle at first. The distant hum of another engine, lower, heavier, not part of the existing line of vehicles. It approached without urgency, without sirens, without the visual declaration of presence that had defined everything else that morning. Just a steady movement forward, controlled, deliberate. Alicia did not turn to look. She did not need to. Her eyes remained on Hale, but something in her posture eased, not in relief, not in triumph, but in recognition, as if a piece of a larger pattern had just fallen into place. Hale followed the gaze of one of his officers despite himself, his head turning slightly, his attention pulled toward the approaching sound. The formation behind him began to shift in a way that could no longer be ignored, small adjustments becoming visible, attention splitting, certainty dividing, the unseen line that had held everything together beginning to loosen. Alicia spoke once more, not louder, not sharper, but with a quiet finality that settled into the air between them. "This is the part where everything changes," she said, and for the first time since he had stepped onto her walkway, Captain Richard Hale did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the far end of the block, where something had just come into view, something that did not match the pattern he had arrived with, something that did not ask for permission to be understood. And in that moment, the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was full, heavy, with the weight of realization that had not yet fully formed but could no longer be avoided. The vehicle did not announce itself with lights or sound. It arrived with presence alone, a long black SUV followed by another and then another, moving slowly down the street as if time itself had adjusted to accommodate it, the engines low and steady, the windows dark, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights without absorbing them. As the convoy approached, the existing line of police vehicles seemed to shift not physically at first, but in meaning, what it filled the street with. Authority now felt crowded, uncertain, like a scene that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Captain Richard Hale turned fully this time, no longer able to divide his attention. His posture remained upright, but something in it had tightened, not outwardly, but internally, like a structure adjusting under pressure it had not anticipated. The SUV came to a controlled stop several yards away, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to be ignored. The engine cut off, and for a brief moment, the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The flashing lights continued, but their rhythm no longer defined the scene. A door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, deliberate motion, and a man stepped out, his suit dark, tailored with precision that did not seek attention but commanded it anyway, his expression neutral, his pace unhurried. He did not look at the crowd, did not scan the street. His focus moved directly toward Alicia Brooks, as if she were the fixed point in a shifting landscape. Another figure stepped out behind him, then another, each carrying the same quiet certainty, the kind that did not need to be reinforced by raised voices or visible displays. Hale took a step forward instinctively, positioning himself between the approaching group and Alicia, not in confrontation, but in reflex, in habit. His voice returned, but it lacked the earlier sharpness. It was controlled, formal now, asking for identification, for clarification, for the reason behind their presence. The man in the suit did not stop immediately. He closed the remaining distance at a measured pace before acknowledging Hale with a slight nod. The kind of acknowledgement that recognized position without conceding to it. His voice when he spoke was calm, direct, and carried a weight that did not rely on volume. He stated that the situation was now under federal oversight, that all local activity would be paused pending immediate review. The words were simple, but they moved through the space with undeniable authority. Hale's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to register, a tightening around the eyes, a recalculation that happened too quickly to be hidden completely behind him. Officers exchanged brief glances, their formation no longer as rigid, their attention divided. Alicia remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. But there was a subtle difference now, not in her stance, but in the way the moment aligned around her. The man in the suit turned slightly toward her, not with surprise, not with curiosity, but with recognition. He spoke her name without hesitation, Alicia Brooks. And in that simple act, the entire narrative of the morning shifted. Because this time, her name was not being called as a target, it was being acknowledged as something known, something established, something that did not require validation from the scene unfolding around it. Hale noticed it, the difference in tone, the absence of doubt, and for the first time, the certainty he had carried onto that street met something it could not override. The man continued, addressing Alicia with a quiet confirmation that her call had been received, that verification had been completed, that her status was now active and recognized. The words were not explained, not expanded, but they did not need to be, because their effect was immediate, visible not in sound but in stillness, the kind that spreads when understanding begins to replace assumption. Alicia gave a small nod, not in relief, not in gratitude, but in acknowledgement of a process that had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Hale stood silent for a moment longer than he intended, his position unchanged but its meaning altered, and in that space, the balance of power, once so clearly defined, had shifted completely, not with force, not with confrontation, but with clarity. No one raised their voice, and that was what made the shift undeniable, because authority did not dissolve in noise. It receded in silence. The man in the dark suit took a single step forward, positioning himself just slightly ahead of Captain Richard Hale, not with force, not with urgency, but with quiet finality, his presence alone redrawing the invisible lines that had governed the street only moments before. He spoke again, this time not to Alicia, but to Hale, his tone respectful but firm, stating that all local operations were to stand down immediately, that any further action required federal coordination, and that documentation would follow through official channels. The words were measured, precise, leaving no space for interpretation. Hale listened, his posture still upright, but something in his stance had shifted, the rigid certainty that once anchored him now replaced by a careful stillness, as if he were recalibrating in real time. Behind him, officers began to ease their positions, not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, coordinated adjustments. Radios lowered slightly, shoulders relaxed by degrees, the formation no longer pressing forward, but holding, waiting. Alicia Brooks remained on the porch, her presence unchanged, neither advancing nor retreating, simply observing as the structure that had surrounded her began to reorganize itself around a new center. The man turned briefly toward her again, his expression composed, and gave a subtle nod. Not ceremonial, not exaggerated, but enough to acknowledge alignment, recognition, confirmation, and in that small gesture, the tension that had stretched across the street began to release, not all at once, but in layers, like pressure lifting from a sealed space. Hale exhaled slowly, though he did not realize he had been holding his breath. His gaze moved once more to Alicia, searching, perhaps, for something that would restore the earlier narrative. But what he found instead was stillness, clarity, a presence that had never matched the assumptions placed upon it, and now could no longer be contained by them. He spoke, his voice quieter than before, more measured, stating that they would comply, that the situation would be reviewed, that no further action would be taken at this time. The words came carefully, each one placed with intention, not as a concession, but as an acknowledgement of a reality that had shifted beyond his control. The man in the suit inclined his head slightly in response, then turned away, signaling without words that the next phase had already begun. One by one, the officers stepped back, not in retreat, but in transition, returning to vehicles, exchanging brief, low conversations that carried none of the earlier urgency. The flashing lights still pulsed, but their meaning had changed, no longer surrounding a target, but marking the end of a misunderstanding that had grown too large before it was corrected. Alicia watched it all without expression, her hands still relaxed at her sides, her shoulders steady. The morning light now fully settled across the street, softening edges, revealing details that had been hidden under intensity just minutes before. A neighbor slowly stepped back inside their home. Another lowered their phone, the quiet observation dissolving as the scene returned to something closer to ordinary, though not entirely, because something had been revealed that could not be unseen. Hale lingered for a moment longer, his gaze fixed briefly on Alicia, not with hostility, not with dominance, but with something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives late. After assumptions have already been tested, he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, then turned and walked back toward his vehicle, the door closing with a muted sound that seemed louder in the now quiet street. The engines began to start, one by one, the line of vehicles preparing to leave. And through it all, Alicia Brooks did not move until the last shift had settled, until the weight of the moment had fully passed, and only then did she turn slightly, her hand resting once more on the edge of the door behind her, the place that had remained constant while everything else had changed. The last vehicle pulled away slowly, its engine fading into the distance until it became just another sound absorbed by the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. The flashing lights disappeared one by one, leaving behind a street that looked almost unchanged, yet felt entirely different, as if something invisible had been lifted from the air. Alicia Brooks remained standing at the threshold for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe. The wood warmed now under the growing morning sun. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, dense with everything that had just happened and everything that had not been said. A bird crossed overhead, its shadow gliding briefly across the pavement before vanishing. A small, ordinary movement that seemed to anchor the world back into place. Alicia stepped inside without hurry, the door closing behind her with a soft, controlled sound that marked the end of the moment more clearly than anything else had. Inside, the house was exactly as she had left it, still, quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator steady in the background, the ceramic mug still waiting near the sink, untouched. She walked past it, her fingers brushing the edge of the counter, grounding herself not in what had just occurred, but in what remained constant, the small, unchanging details that defined her space. She paused in the center of the room, the same place she had stood when the first impact shook the door, but now the air felt different, lighter, not because something had been won, but because something had been revealed, something that no longer needed to remain hidden. Outside, a neighbor's car door closed, footsteps moved along a sidewalk, the world continuing as it always did. Unaware of the quiet shift that had just taken place, Alicia exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in completion, her shoulders settling into a natural ease. She moved toward the window and adjusted the curtain slightly, allowing the sunlight to enter more freely, illuminating the room in soft, even tones. There was no urgency in her movements, no need to revisit the scene outside, because what mattered had already unfolded exactly as it needed to. She reached for her phone, glancing briefly at the screen, a single notification confirming what she already knew: verification complete, status active. She did not linger on it, did not react, simply locked the screen and set it down beside the mug, the same quiet routine reclaiming its place. As if the extraordinary had only passed through for a moment before giving way again to the ordinary. And yet, beneath that stillness, there was a subtle shift in the way the space held her, a a quiet acknowledgement that nothing about her had changed, but everything about how she was seen had. Alicia turned toward the hallway, her steps soft against the floor, the light following her as she moved, and as the house settled back into silence. There was no need for words, no need for explanation. Because the truth of the moment did not echo, it remained, steady, unspoken, and undeniable.